Hey,
Hey, calling
uh,
Chris Anderson in London. You're still in London.
temporarily, but I'm back in Studio A, so that's good.
Wow,
Yeah,
daughter has left.
she's back in Toronto, yeah.
Okay, fantastic.
And you're in
Uh,
Chicago?
I am here in the
Oh,
Grand Chicago studio. Welcome everybody to History Happy Hour. Thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for helping to bring you this show. Please check out their rich offering of history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. And Chris, whether you're watching live or watching on replay, or if you're listening to,
HHS podcast.
yeah, oh, really good. We are glad you're here. And today we talk about the 1860 political convention in Chicago that nominated Abraham Lincoln. And we want to take a moment to thank all of our Patreon supporters. There they are. Well, there's the top shelf
Yay.
patrons. We have others Patreon supporters as well. We do thank all of you. We'll do another credit roll of everybody who honors us on Patreon sometime in the next few weeks. You can become a Patreon supporter by going to patreon.com/history happy hour. So Chris, when do you hit the road?
I hit the road again tomorrow morning at 7 on my way to the south of France for the 80th anniversary of Operation Dragoon, and then after that to Warsaw. So,
wow. Well, I hit the road on Thursday.
yeah.
Headed to London,
Nice.
so I'll be replacing you in London.
Yeah, well, Mrs. Anderson said if you need to do laundry or anything, you can stop by Studio A and she'll help hook you up.
And so I'm doing a D-Day tour. So I'll be doing London to Normandy to Paris, and I will be in Paris when we do our show in 2 weeks on the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Paris.
Cool.
I will be in Paris.
That's pretty cool.
I am excited about that. So I'm going to try to do some videotaping at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier or something to kind of honor
Paris place.
Yeah. Okay. Who's out there, Chris? Do we have anybody watching?
Well, we have Buff Civil War and Lorelei Cam and Brian Peacock has joined us. Gwendolyn Simmons, Tony Coulter. Hey, it's good to see Tony again. We haven't seen him up there. So yeah.
And Marie, I see, and I don't know who. High Noon 1952. Hello,
That's
High
new
Noon.
people. That's great.
Okay, yeah. All right. Well, I think that we are ready to get the show on the road. So give me a cue, and we'll get it started.
All right. Hey, that was the real bell tool, not the recorded
real bell right here.
Wow.
I'll have to remember to bring it with me.
Absolutely.
The Democrats are bringing their convention to Chicago a week from this Monday, and there have been many conventions here in Chicago, but the first was in 1860 when a longshot candidate named Abraham Lincoln, you may have heard of him, was named as the candidate. And we're going to talk about that convention today with Edward Achorn, who's the author of The Lincoln Miracle Inside the Republican Convention That Changed History. And Ed spent 20 years as an editorial pages editor of the Providence Journal, my hometown, Providence, Rhode Island, where he was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. He has written a number of books, and this one has won, Chris, get ready. Okay, I got a list here. The Lincoln Forum Book Prize, the Lincoln Institute Book Prize, the Julia Ward Howe Prize for Nonfiction, and the Lincoln Group of New York's Award of Achievement. So Ed Achorn, congratulations on all those prizes, and welcome to History Happy Hour.
Oh, thank you so much. It's great to be here.
And Chris, did you bring a cocktail to this week's show?
Got my Glentur at 12.
Okay, great. I have a beer, and Ed, you've got black cherry seltzer. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Just seltzer.
Okay, no, it's good enough. It's good enough. When we look back at this convention that nominated this longshot candidate, Abraham Lincoln, we see it, of course, as a stepping stone towards his presidency, towards the Civil War, towards ultimately the end of slavery. So it really is a convention that changed history. But how was it viewed at the time by the many delegates, journalists, and visitors coming to Chicago? Did they have a sense of this, that this might be kind of an epic event?
Well, they knew that big trouble was coming to the country. They knew that the South was threatening to secede if the Republicans won the election. So they had some very deep qualms. But the thing I discovered researching this book is that the delegates didn't really choose a candidate on the basis of who would make the best president in a national crisis. They were just concerned about who would attract the most votes and get them the most jobs and patronage and all that stuff. I mean, it's quite striking that the qualities of the individual candidates really didn't weigh much with the delegates. They were just strictly political professionals looking for votes. And they looked at Lincoln as a sort of a compromise figure who wouldn't turn off too many swing voters and who would still attract the base to support the party. So I don't think they had any idea that they were nominating somebody who was just uniquely qualified to handle that crisis and get this nation through to the other side. I don't think any of these other candidates would have been able to do it.
So, Ed, I think, and I hope I'm not stepping out on too much of a limb here when I say that, when I watch conventions, political party conventions these days, they're pretty pro forma, pretty boring, and pretty predictable. So I obviously one of the things that was fascinating in your book is it wasn't like that then. So maybe just for kind of to lay a foundation for what we're going to be talking about, explain to us how the conventions work then, why they're different than they are now, and why it was everything to play for, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, I mean the conventions now are just infomercials really for the parties, and they get a little bit of TV time and preen around and so forth. But in 1860, in the mid 19th century, these things were everything. I mean, the political professionals from around the country gathered at the convention, and they made decisions in the smoke-filled rooms about who they wanted to be the nominee. And often the voting on the floor, they had no idea what was going to happen on the floor. So they were very exciting events, I mean, tremendously exciting.
Yeah. So in 1860, the Republicans are a pretty new party. They're built around anti-slavery. Chicago is a pretty new city. It's gone in the last 20 years before 1860 from 4,000 people to about 100,000 people, which is quite a growth in 20 years. What brings the convention to this city that I'm in, Chicago, and how much of an impact does that have on the fact that this is the convention that happens to nominate somebody from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln?
Well, it's kind of ironic, and it's in keeping with the theme of a Lincoln miracle. They chose Chicago because they thought it was a location that could handle big crowds, but it was also neutral ground. No serious candidate came from Illinois, and they viewed Lincoln as not a serious candidate. And it made all the difference for Lincoln, really, because his men were able to go to the convention. They could afford it. They could be there on the ground. They could help him. The candidates in those days didn't go to the conventions. They stayed at home. And Lincoln actually was contemplating going to Chicago to the convention. And he told a friend that he was too much of a candidate to go, but not quite enough to stay home. So he eventually decided to stay in Springfield, thankfully, and he was a major candidate up there.
Well, I want to get into Lincoln a little bit more, particularly kind of an aspect of him that I usually don't talk very much about it. But before we do that, the Republican Party, I think we should also maybe talk a little bit about its birth and some of the different factions in it, because it's sort of a new animal, right? This is not one of the age-old parties.
It was. They had only run one national campaign earlier, which was in 1856. They had a guy named John Fremont, who was they called him the Pathfinder. He was a pioneer adventurer type, and he was nominated. but they did quite well in that election, and the Democrats won that, but the Republicans definitely had a future after that election. So, but it was a mishmash. Basically, the only thing everybody in the party agreed on was that the Democrats were terrible. But other than that, there were people who were anti-immigrant who were in the party. There were anti-slavery people, of course. That was a very important part of the base. But there were just people who didn't like the Democrats and didn't like where they were taking the country. So it was a real mixture of all sorts of people and different interests. And this is one of the things the delegates meeting in Chicago had to figure out, how to placate all these interests and not turn off too many people at the polls.
So Abraham Lincoln, give us a sketch of who he is at this point. I mean, he's been a congressman, but it's been a long time. He's he ran for Senate against Stephen Douglas. What kind of national reputation does he have at this point?
Yeah, he had just served 2 years in Congress. That was his whole national profile. He had
it was like 11 years before.
Right, more
years.
than a decade. It had been more than a decade since he had been in office, any office. He had lost 2 Senate runs. He was very popular with the Republican Party in Illinois, and he had lost 2 Senate runs really heartbreakingly, because he thought he could win both of those. And he thought his career was finished after the second race against, back then they were races for the legislature. The legislature picked the senators, so you had to get enough legislative candidates in office to win the Senate, and Lincoln wasn't able to do that. He won more popular votes than Stephen Douglas, but the way the districts were apportioned, he couldn't win the Senate seat. And he thought his career was over then. He thought he was finished. And any sort of national prominence he had really came from his fights with Stephen Douglas, who was much more famous than Lincoln. He was this rising Democratic star, and people looked at him as the potential Democratic nominee in 1860 for years. So that's how Lincoln gained prominence. This sort of lawyer who didn't have this tremendously successful background was debating Douglas and actually pinning him to the wall and doing this great job debating him. So he got sort of a national reputation from that. And then he had also gone east, and he delivered a speech at some people who didn't like William Seward, the superstar of the Republican Party, arranged for various other Republicans to come speak in New York to sort of try to derail him a little bit. And Lincoln had gone to the Cooper Union and spoken there and delivered a speech that impressed the New Yorkers very much. So any prominence he had came from those 2 things: fighting Douglas and that speech back east.
But one of the things that I found really fascinating about your book, it's not entirely new, but you really touch on this well, is his ambition. So, we have kind of this image of Lincoln as, he's just really a nice guy, and he's kind of folksy, and we have already had some questions about Lincoln's image that I want to get to, but can you talk a little bit about his ambition? I mean, this guy is driven, right? He wants to succeed.
Yeah, his law partner had a great line about him. He said, Lincoln's ambition was a little engine that knew no rest. He was constantly plotting and trying to get in the Senate. That was his dream job, and he constantly worked on that. And after he lost the second Senate run to Douglas, he worked very hard to sort of steer the Republican Party away from these sort of infighting and these minor issues and these personalities, and keep focused on just one issue, which was stopping the spread of slavery beyond the states to the territories. And that he wanted the Republicans to stand for just that one issue. and to throw away all these secondary issues. And that actually became sort of the force of the party in 1860. So he had a really interesting influence behind the scenes. He was brilliant. He had a great strategy for the convention, but he didn't believe himself. He kept telling people he didn't feel he was qualified for the presidency. He even laughed about it a couple of years earlier, that he was talking to a reporter, and he said his wife thought he would be president someday. And he said, "Imagine a sucker like me as president." He just burst out laughing. And some of that was sort of to keep people sort of hide his talent.
I mean, I was going to say, do you think that was an image he was putting out, or
kind of? It was able to help him sneak up on people. He wasn't as big a threat to, for instance, I mentioned William Seward. He was this former governor of New York. He had been the most prominent Republican in the country. He was a senator. New York was the biggest and most powerful state at the time. And Seward was somebody people loved. They wanted him to be president. They mobbed him. He went on a trip to Europe. He met with world leaders. And all the world leaders were thinking, this guy's going to be the next president of the United States. Came back, he was mobbed by his fans. It was like Seward mania or something. And his people went to the convention thinking he had this thing sewed up. He was just going to be nominated. And Lincoln's people managed to pull the rug out from under him. It's quite a funny story.
It's a shocking story, honestly, as you read it, and you kind of go, when you get to the end, you're like, how did it? Still try to really get my arms around how it happened. You know what the moment is. William Seward going into the convention, and we'll approach this stage by stage, so as we try to tell the story. William Seward is, of course, as you mentioned, he's the senator and former governor from New York. And he is backed by this very amazing figure, New York State political boss, Thurlow Weed, who's been a political boss since the time of John Quincy Adams. I mean, he's been there a long time. And Seward, everybody thinks Seward's going to win. And Seward is widely loved, as you pointed out, but he's also, and we see this with some modern politicians who will all go nameless. He also is loved by a lot of people, but there's a sizable amount of opposition as well, that maybe they underestimate as they're going into the convention. But why is there parts of the country or parts of the Republican Party that don't want Seward to become president?
Well,
or at least become the nominee. Yeah.
Right. The political professionals were nervous about him because certain things had happened. John Brown, who was a radical abolitionist, in October of the previous year, he had gone down to Virginia now, and had planned to arm
Harper's Ferry, right?
Yeah, Harper's Ferry, but now West Virginia. But he planned to arm slaves with weapons he seized from an armory there, and stage a revolution, an insurrection against the white slave owners in the South. And this panicked people in the South, enraged people in the South, and it made people in the North very nervous. And Seward was associated with, not directly with Brown, but his statements about slavery had been very powerful, as powerful as Lincoln's, but he was more famous than Lincoln. So he made a lot of these political professionals very nervous that he would turn off swing voters. I mean, a lot of people were saying all this slavery talk was going to drive us into a civil war if we didn't watch it. And that's why voters were they thought would be very nervous about voting for Seward for president. And they were worried they'd lose all these down ticket races if Seward was the nominee. And, but he very nearly became the nominee in spite of that.
But I mean, one of the things that I kind of is as you're approaching the convention, clearly a large number, not all, but a large number of the Republicans are anti-slavery.
Yes.
What did they think was going to happen? I mean, were there actually anybody in the Republican Party, and if so, who were saying, well, no, we can kind of get this thing back on track? But did they really think that they were going to avoid civil war?
Well, they thought that the South had blustered about secession for decades, which many of the leaders had, and the North's view was, look, they extracted all these concessions out of us by threatening to secede from the Union. We've just had it with the Democrats and this whole approach. People in the North were getting more and more aggravated with what the slaveocracy was doing. They had a Massachusetts senator named Charles Sumner had been beaten almost to death on the floor of the Senate. A South Carolina congressman who was offended by something he had said in the Senate came over with a cane and beat him into submission. He was left a bloody pulp on the ground, and he had mental brain issues the rest of his life. It was just brutal, and people were saying, how much longer can we put up with this? Now the Republic, so many people in the North thought, look, it's time to just push back, but they didn't expect it would plunge the country into civil war. They thought it was more of the same, more of the bluster. And I guess people never realized when things have been pushed too far until they have been.
Yeah.
So the attitude then is like, okay, we don't want to have a civil war, but we're done messing around now. So we're going to do what we're going to do, and you can deal with the results. Right.
That's pretty much the attitude. But even so, they were nervous about Seward because he was so well known as a radical anti-slavery guy. And the irony is Lincoln had the exact same positions, but he was not as well known, so he wasn't as scary to the swing voters.
Right.
So everybody's coming into Chicago, and as you mentioned, Chicago's about 100,000 people, and something like 80,000 people come in to the city for this. So I can only imagine. I mean, they had a Metallica concert at Soldier Field the other night, and they had 50,000 people at that. I can only imagine what it would have been like with 80,000 people coming in.
Where were you? Where were you for the Metallica concert?
I was in the front row, man. I was there because I love Metallica and their hit song.
That one.
Yeah, I have no idea what any song by Metallica would be. Marilyn and I were actually trying to look up like who's Metallica's lead singer, and we found the name. I was like, yeah, never heard of that guy. So, but we saw the people walking around in their Metallica t-shirts. I'm so happy that we got Metallica into our discussion of Lincoln and the 1860 convention. Who else would do that but us, but me? Okay. Yeah. All those people are coming into Chicago, and one of the best known people who's coming in is a journalist and activist who likes to wear a white linen coat, and his name is Horace Greeley. Talk a little bit about who he is and what his single-minded purpose in coming to this convention is.
Well, this is one of the reasons Lincoln won the nomination. Horace Greeley was the best-known newspaper editor in the country. He had a weekly version of the New York Tribune that went into houses all over the Midwest, all over the North, really. So he was sort of a household name, and he was a editor, a philosopher. People really followed what he had to say. So he came to Chicago. He was dead set on Seward not winning. He supported another candidate, a very intelligent judge from Missouri named Edward Bates. He said Seward at the top of the ticket would doom the Republican Party. They had to put up somebody more moderate, even though Greeley was very liberal himself.
Okay. But that's what he said.
Yeah,
But there's a
but
little bit more behind this, isn't there?
yes, yes, he had personal reasons for being offended with both Weed and Seward. They had been a part of a triumvirate, really, in New York politics for many years, and they worked together to advance Seward and advance the
Thurlow
Whig.
Weed and
Yes,
Greeley and Seward had all worked
yeah,
together.
they had all worked together to advance what was then the Whig Party, which had faded out by 1860. But what happened in those days is these newspaper editors wanted to be rewarded with power for the work they did. And Greeley wanted to be lieutenant governor of New York. And he was such a whack job, really, that Seward and Weed thought they wouldn't dare put him in that position. He would turn off a lot of people and they would lose a lot of votes. So Greeley was deeply offended by this. He wanted to be lieutenant governor of New York. And to make it worse, they gave the job to his rival editor from New York, Henry Raymond from the New York Times. So these editors were not really very objective in those days. So many people thought Greeley came to Chicago to attack Seward simply for political reasons, for vengeance, because Seward had blocked his political career, Seward and Weed. And but people, whenever it was like the old commercial, whenever he whispered, people listened. They dropped everything and listened. Greeley was very influential, especially with Republican delegates. And they listened to his warnings about Seward's. The Seward people felt very strongly at the end of that convention that rat was responsible for Seward losing the nomination.
That rat being Horace Greeley.
Yes, yeah. So there's a lot of personal passions and personal agendas involved in all of this, and it's quite a miracle that it all worked to push up Lincoln's candidacy.
It really does seem that, that somehow this person who is this kind of transcendent figure in our history. I mean, we stand there at the Lincoln Memorial, you honor the visage of Abraham Lincoln, you think about him as president, and that, it's managed to because Horace Greeley was pissed off at Thurlow Weed and William Seward that Lincoln even gets a chance to be president.
Well, that was part of it, and it was certainly a powerful part of it. So,
one of the things I'm going to post this question. This is from Wally Morrison, and it says, "Please help me to understand how the age of only print media that ideas for Civil War or anything else could be so quickly transmitted to the general population." And I'm reminded of that because obviously, you've just mentioned Greeley, and the question struck me because as I was reading your book. You have all of these wonderful quotes from people from that time getting involved in this story and just, this was not happening somewhere else. I mean, everybody was kind of aware of what was going on. So how is the word getting out?
Well, there had been a revolution in communications and in media. Newspapers had access to telegraph wires, and so they could instantly transmit news around the country and print it very quickly. So people could find out what was going on very quickly, and people read and were passionate about politics. So they followed all the debates on the pages of the newspapers. So newspapers were very influential in these fights back then, as the media is today, I suppose.
Right.
So, going into this convention, and even for the first few days of the convention in May of 1860, here in Chicago, Seward is the favorite. He's the guy that has the money. He's got the political boss behind him. He's got the marching bands coming in. He's got 3,000 people leading parades. And Lincoln has got a few guides. He's got a team in Chicago. He's not here. Seward's not here either. But what is Lincoln's strategy? And who is here in Chicago to carry it out? Who do we have to thank for being kind of the Lincoln managers and making this happen?
Well, Lincoln's strategy was, I know I'm not going to be the favorite of many delegates at this convention. He was considered just a favorite son candidate from Illinois and probably a Veep nominee at best, when he went into this thing. But Lincoln's strategy was, don't offend any of the other candidates, sort of an anti-Trump strategy. Don't offend anyone. Go in there and just not say anything bad about the other candidates. Just present us as the best alternative in case people can't get their first love nominated, as Lincoln put it. And so his people very carefully worked not to offend the strong supporters of Seward or Bates or any of these other candidates, Chase or anyone else. And the other was another part of that question.
So who was Lincoln's team?
Oh, his team, yes. Lincoln had was a lawyer in Illinois. He had spent 6 months of the year traveling around on what they called the circuit, which was going to small town to administer justice. And he traveled with a judge, a 300-pound judge named David Davis, who was a very pragmatic, no-nonsense guy. He's quite an interesting figure. And Davis went up to Chicago as part of Lincoln's team to run things. But the whole thing was completely disorganized. Davis got up there and he discovered the campaign was so disorganized, nobody had even booked a room for their headquarters. And this is in the city that's overrun with people, so you couldn't easily find a room. So he bribed a family to leave their rooms in the Tremont Hotel and put up a Lincoln headquarters sign. And at that moment, Davis said, I'm going to run this thing. Nobody appointed him. He just decided somebody has to run this, and I'm going to. And he did a brilliant job. He barely slept, excuse me, for 6 days. And he made a lot of interesting deals behind the scenes to try to advance Lincoln. And he immediately saw that Seward was not as strong as people had been saying, and that the delegates were casting around for an alternative. And he worked very hard to make Lincoln that alternative.
So, maybe you could speak to this. Is Lincoln driving this nomination strategy, or is Davis? Who's the mastermind behind all this?
Well, the mastermind's really Lincoln, but he's not there on the scene. So Davis has to do the lifting for him in Chicago. Right. And, in fact, Davis was doing some stuff Lincoln didn't want him to do, like promising cabinet positions in return for support. Lincoln sent him a message, make no deals in my name. And the Lincoln forces were just crestfallen because how are we going to compete with Seward if we can't make deals? Right. Davis just looked at that message and sort of put it in his pocket and said, Lincoln ain't here. We don't know what we have to deal with, so we'll just act as if we didn't get the message from him at all. And that's what they did.
So we're going to get into the voting and everything that happened. But as we mentioned, 80,000 people come into the city of 100,000. You paint a pretty rich picture of what Chicago was like that week. Can you give us a taste of that here?
Well, I mean, Chicago it was like a brilliant symbol of America because it had grown just dramatically from nothing. And people were investing in it like crazy. It was in this great location, which made it sort of the transportation hub of the world. Even by 1860, there were more railroad lines going into Chicago than anywhere in the world. But this kind of it had just grown up on the swampy banks of the Chicago River. And this created a lot of problems. I mean, the city was overrun with rats, and it had horrible health
And
problems.
aside from Horace Greeley, right?
Yeah, exactly. It had horrible health problems from sewage and all sorts of stuff. So the city was in the middle while all this convention was going on. Was in the middle of raising all of its buildings downtown with giant screw devices, raising every building so they could put in another layer of dirt, like 10 feet of dirt, and build sewer pipes underneath it. So it had this crazy effect on Chicago where you'd be walking down the street and then have to go down a flight of stairs to the old level of the street and then go up a flight of stairs to the new level, and drunks were falling down these stairs and so forth. And this great descriptions of the vermin population in Chicago, just running over people's shoes and everything. So this was the city at the time, and the Chicago River had the color and consistency of pea soup. It was filled with
It's like St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah, it was filled with all sorts of terrible stuff, and women had to hold handkerchiefs over their noses when they shopped downtown. So this is what the delegates were coming into in Chicago. So I just had fun describing the city at the time. But it was so overrun, people didn't even have room enough to stay. I mean, there was the son of one of the candidates, a Supreme Court Justice, John McClain. His son had to stay in a room with two other people, and he felt lucky to get it. And they were drunk half the time and carrying on at night while he was trying to sleep. And he describes all this. And then they put down at 11 o'clock at night, they closed down all the pool tables in the hotels and put people on top of those to sleep. So it was kind of a wild scene in Chicago.
It's kind of like getting a room in Normandy in June, Rick.
Yeah.
So, one of the things that you mentioned earlier, Ed, was that, Lincoln was trying really hard, with this new Republican Party to keep people focused and not get involved in other squabbles and other issues. But one of the other issues that runs through the book that, again, I think people have sort of maybe pushed to the side, that I found really fascinating and shows you that certain issues come back time and time again, is the issue of immigration. So if you could talk a little bit about that. I know we had questions from one of our guests about the know-nothings, and also, I guess in particular, the Germans, because, when we think about immigrants, we don't think about Germans as immigrants, but that's a massive community and they're going through their own issues and they get involved in all this.
Right. You're entirely right. The Democrats were the party of immigrants, and they would grab them coming right off the boat and register them to vote. So they knew nothing about America. They were immediately voting in elections, and many people thought that was corrupt. They should know a little bit about the country and be invested in the country a little bit. And there was a lot of religious prejudice against Catholics coming in, for instance, from Ireland. They were worried that the Pope would run America instead of the American system of the people running things. So it was a large group of people who were anti-immigrant. They formed a party called the Know Nothing Party. It was actually called the American Party, but when people went to their meetings, they would say, I know nothing, when somebody questioned them about it. So it became known as the Know Nothing Party, and that was an important part of the Republican base. That was one of the things they had to worry about. Seward had been very supportive of immigrants. He had met with the Catholic leader of New York. He had been very sympathetic to Irish immigrants, even though he was Republican. So he was sort of persona non grata with the know-nothings. And on the other side, there were people had no idea where Lincoln stood on this. He was very, very quiet about it, but he was adamantly against the Know Nothing Party in reality. Yeah, I tell a story in the book. He had a gardener named Pat, and he asked Pat once, who was Irish, and asked Pat why he hadn't been born in America. And Pat replied, "Faith, Mr. Lincoln, I wanted to be, but my mother wouldn't let me." So Lincoln would tell this story. And this other character, Bates, I mentioned, this judge from Missouri, he was very popular with the moderates, but he had flirted with the Know Nothing Party. And this really offended the German immigrant voters in the Republican Party. Now, they were only a tiny percentage of the Republican vote, but they were enough to sway elections in many northern states. So suddenly they became very important to the party. And they went so far as to hold their own convention that same week in Chicago, right down the street from the Republican one, to send a very scary message to the delegates: don't nominate Bates. He's been associated with the Know Nothing Party. We don't want him. You got to pick somebody else. And that was another reason Lincoln rose as a possible alternative to Seward instead of somebody like Bates.
Yeah.
So we're going to get into the day, that Friday of the fateful day. But I want to, before we do that, I want to just mention the location of this convention, because this is a building that's no longer here in Chicago, the Wigwam, as it was called, a convention center built pretty quickly just for this convention. Give us a sense of what this place was like for the people going in there for the convention, and kind of what the physical scene is like.
Yeah, it had been thrown up in only 6 weeks. They were going to have the convention originally in a smaller place in Chicago, and they said, this won't work. We got to send a message to the world that Chicago's a great place and we can accommodate this big crowds and so forth. So they built this place really fast. It was built of wood, and it had flaring natural gas inside for lighting, along with the windows. But the ladies of Chicago decorated it with, you can see there, with bunting and with the evergreens. And as Bruce Catton, who's one of my favorite historians, said, it must have been all around the greatest fire trap ever built in America. Because you can imagine this thing would go up in 2 seconds, and it did go up a few years later in 2 seconds, and all those people in there would have been killed. But fortunately, that didn't happen. And the picture you showed of the interior, that's sort of looking down. There's the stage on the left, and that's where the delegates were, on the stage on the left. And the speakers were where that guy is standing up. And there was no amplification. It was just the curve of that ceiling sort of helped amplify the voices so everybody in the room could hear it in the hall. They could pack 11,000 people in there. And you're sort of looking down on that stage from what was called the Ladies Gallery. And that gallery existed so ladies could enter and sit in the gallery and not have to deal with men on the ground level there. But it was it got to the point where men who wanted to get into that gallery had to find a woman to go in with them if they wanted to get inside the building. So they were sort of hiring streetwalkers and washerwomen and any woman they could run across to accompany them into the hall so they could get in and see what was going on.
Well, so we've now, of course, talked far too long about all the preliminary stuff. So let's talk about the day, as Rick said. Briefest of outlines. What's happening there? What's the process? How does?
Well, maybe I can take you back to Thursday night. Thursday during the convention, there had been a whole series of test votes. Seward's team had won all of them. So it looked like Seward was going to win the nomination. the crowd was sort of with him. They had voted in his favor, the delegates. So they were almost ready to begin the nominating process, and the front desk, the podium announced, well, we don't have the tally sheets yet. This will take about 5 minutes to get these. And the delegates decided, oh, we're hungry, it's 6 o'clock, we're tired, we'll come back tomorrow morning and nominate Seward. And so for want of those tally sheets, Seward was not nominated that night, which I think he would have been. And that's where, yes, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that you write that they adjourn, and at 11:40 that night, Horace Greeley, who is opposed to Seward's nomination, says, "My conclusion from all that I can gather tonight," he's wiring back to his newspaper, "is that the opposition to Governor Seward cannot concentrate on any other candidate, and that he will be nominated." So Greeley thinks he's going to be nominated. Seward thinks he's going to be nominated. Thurlow Weed thinks Seward is going to be nominated. Everybody thinks Seward's going to be nominated. What the hell happens to change that between 11:40 p.m. and when they gather to vote the next day?
Well, with the time that he had been given, David Davis started bribing other delegations to get on the Lincoln, to make Lincoln the alternative. He had first worked on the Indiana delegation, which was pretty sympathetic to Illinois. But I think he promised the cabinet seat to the head of the Illinois delegation.
Indiana.
Then he had to get Pennsylvania. Now, Pennsylvania was run by a machine politician named Simon Cameron, who was essentially went to send his men to Chicago to essentially sell his wares, get the best deal he could get, because Pennsylvania then as now was a very important swing state. And Lincoln had said before the convention, I want that big foot of Pennsylvania to come down on my side. Lincoln understood how important that was. So Davis made a deal with the Cameron people to put Cameron in as Treasury Secretary. And Cameron was a very corrupt politician who was a big businessman, and it would have stunk to high heaven if people had heard that at the time. And so the next day, and then Lincoln's men did some other funny stuff overnight. They did things like print up counterfeit tickets to the Wigwam, and they signed them, forged the names of the Republican officials on these tickets, and they gave them to Lincoln supporters. So the next morning, the Seward people are marching in the streets. This is part of Weed's psychological operation, showing sort of the inevitable force of support for Seward. They're marching in the streets, and the bands are blasting, and they get to the Wigwam, and they find many of their seats had been taken by Lincoln supporters, even though they had legitimate tickets. So that was part of it. And also the Lincoln's men brought in these champion shouters and put them in strategic locations in the convention hall, so that they could create this impression with all the Lincoln people they had stuffed in that boy, Lincoln's really popular. He's really got the heart of the delegates with him. So anyways, they have this, they go in and start voting, and the last thing Seward gets is a telegram saying, this is in the bag, don't worry about it, it's all set, you're going to be nominated this morning. And Seward's way ahead on the first ballot, but he hasn't won it. So when Lincoln was back in Springfield, he saw that telegram come in. Seward was way ahead. Lincoln had about 100 delegates, a few more than that. And Lincoln immediately thought, Seward's not going to win this. And he immediately rushed to the newspaper office, which had a telegraph machine, because he wanted to be right there when the news came in. Seward was in his garden at his mansion in Auburn, New York, and he thought the first first ballot was all right. He thought he'd pick up steam on the second and third ballots. What happened on the second ballot was that the Pennsylvania delegates suddenly swung into place for Lincoln. And Lincoln had almost as many votes as Seward. So it's, on the third ballot, finally Lincoln toppled Seward and won the nomination. And the crowd the hall was going absolutely crazy. And they had somebody firing a gun on the roof of the Wigwam, which I imagine was a fire hazard as well.
So as I read that, in my mind, all I could picture was that famous photograph of Truman holding up the newspaper, right? So given that, Seward was the anointed son, he was going to get this, everybody expected it. What's the reaction around the country as word gets out that it's this guy Lincoln? I mean,
well, there was a great fear in the Republican Party that Lincoln's not going to have enough popular support from the base to carry this thing. Boy, they should have gone with Seward. There was a lot of feeling along those lines. People didn't really know Lincoln. They called him Abram, although his name was Abraham. They couldn't even get his name right. They didn't really know a lot about him. So it was a shocking outcome. And nobody was more shocked than the Seward supporters. They were just livid. They thought this whole convention was a farce. Imagine nominating a rail splitter instead of somebody who's highly educated, highly experienced, really knew his way around Washington and so forth. So it was quite a shocking development. And some people had thought, oh, let's bring Lincoln up here to make a speech before the delegates leave town. And about 12 people from Lincoln's team sent him telegrams saying, don't come up here, don't come up here. Because they knew it would just infuriate the Seward supporters. And maybe it would get out how many deals they had made to secure Lincoln's nomination.
So another question from a viewer. We're getting near the end here, but I want to bring this in from Wally. This says, please speculate how Seward would have done in preserving the Union and winning the war. So, I mean, that's an alternate history question, which you don't really go into in the book. But you must have thought about it a little bit.
Yeah, as I said, my personal view is none of these candidates would have succeeded in keeping this country together. I mean, Lincoln had unique qualities of willpower, ability to get over disappointment. He was so melancholy to begin with that he had suffered so many setbacks in his life that he was very well trained for that terrible war. He was so intelligent, so politically adroit in knowing when to push certain ideas and when not to, including emancipation. I think, Seward early on Lincoln had put him on his cabinet as Secretary.
Became Secretary of State, right?
Secretary of State, which was the most important position. And Seward thought he would actually run the administration as a kind of engineer. And Lincoln had to put him in his place. And that's a very interesting story. But Seward came around and understood, oh my gosh, this guy's the best of all of us. He's a brilliant executive with no executive experience at all. And I think Seward, Seward wanted to do things like start a war with European powers to sort of bring the country together at the start of the Civil War, which would have been a disaster. You would have had the country fighting on two fronts. And Seward did not have the sort of grip that Lincoln had on political reality, I think. And so I think any of those other candidates, this country would not have survived. That's why I view it as a miracle Lincoln was nominated and became president.
Good time.
You got one. You got one more, Chris. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
You got a gun in the holster. Pull it out.
No. I just did you, as you were going through this process and doing this research, were you surprised with what you found out? I mean, did you see a new side of Lincoln or find things that you didn't expect to see? Because, Lincoln is one of these characters we all think we know what we need to know about him, right? But
well, Lincoln's always surprising, whenever you look at him, whatever period, whatever he's doing, he's so sharp. He's so sort of humane. He understands the golden rule. He doesn't take offense. He doesn't. He's just an amazing personality, and I just feel totally privileged to have spent like the last 10 years of my life in his presence every day, reading what he wrote, thinking about what he did and what he said. And he's an amazing figure. I don't know what surprised me about this whole thing is just what a miracle it was that he was nominated, and how the delegates weren't choosing him they didn't understand what a great president he would be. No one did.
Well, Ed, thank you so much for joining us today and to talk about your book, The Lincoln Miracle Inside the Republican Convention That Changed History. We probably also should have mentioned that, you have a new house, which is why, you don't have bookshelves back there or a nice, warm fire or something. But thank you for joining us at that time. We appreciate your coming on History Happy Hour.
Well, thank you, Rick and Chris. It's very kind of you to have me.
We appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Excellent. Chris, so next week.
Yes.
It's always about next. We get this week. It was great. It was great talking about Lincoln. I love a little Lincoln story here, and a lot of questions I didn't get to ask. But next week, we're going to go to Berlin.
We're going to Berlin. Okay.
We are. Get your ticket. We're going to go to Berlin in the years leading up to World War II to follow the exploits of an extraordinary Chicago Tribune reporter named Sigrid Schultz. And we'll welcome Pamela Toller, who is the author of a new book, author of a new book about Schultz, The Dragon Lady from Chicago, the untold story of an American reporter in Nazi Germany. And I have not looked at this book yet, but I have heard of Sigrid Schultz, and she features in some other accounts of the story of Hitler's rise. She's apparently a very strong-minded woman, and the fact is that she is the Chicago Tribune bureau chief in Chicago.
A Chicago theme going on here.
I know, really, at a time when women mostly didn't have those jobs. Although I should mention that in Ed's book about the 1860 convention, there's a woman named Mary Livermore who is in the press gallery who some stuff happens to, and I looked her up, and she ends up being a really interesting person. So, there's everywhere you look, there's a story. But next week, Sigrid Schultz, and of course, we'll both be on the road.
Yeah. So
who knows?
I'll be flapping my arms to keep the lights on.
Who knows what kind of Wi-Fi we'll have or level of energy or whatever. We'll both be, by next week, I'll be in London still, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe I'll be in Bournemouth. I'm not sure. And you'll be in, where will you be next Sunday?
I think Sunday I'll be in Lyon.
Lyon. Right, so we're closing the gap, but we are not going to, I think, ever quite run into each other. We'll keep track and we'll find out. Guys, thank you so much for joining us today. Please, please, please subscribe to us on YouTube. Follow us on Facebook. Shout at us on Twitter. Listen to our podcast. Back us on patreon.com. And browse historyhappyhour.com.
What he said. Be safe, everybody.